Sometimes the only way to keep your head above water is to let someone else drown first. Linette Marsh learned that lesson the hard way. Not in a classroom, not from a book, from the back seat of a black sedan at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, with her stepfather's cologne still clinging to the collar of the only decent blouse she owned. She hadn't cried. She'd wanted to, the way you want to sneeze when the feeling builds and then just doesn't happen. The tears were there, somewhere behind her sternum, lodged like a stone she couldn't swallow. But crying would have meant accepting what was happening, and Linette wasn't ready to accept it. She was still doing the math. $40,000. That was what Roland had told the men on the phone. She'd heard him through the heating vent in her bedroom floor, the one that ran directly above the kitchen, where Roland did all his important conversations at 10 o'clock, when he thought everyone was asleep. 40,000. Like she was a car he was trading in. Like she was a piece of furniture he'd decided didn't match the new decor. She thought about the number as the sedan moved through the wet streets of Portland. Not the pretty part of Portland, not the part with the food carts and the weekend farmers markets, but the industrial eastern edge where the warehouses sat dark and the streetlights were spaced too far apart to do any real good. 40,000. She knew Roland's debts because she'd been keeping his books for 3 years, ever since his bookkeeper quit, and he decided that a stepdaughter with a head for numbers was a free solution to a problem he didn't want to pay for. She knew exactly what he owed, and to whom. She knew 40,000 barely made a dent, and she knew that whoever was receiving her tonight had paid that number not out of kindness but out of calculation. The sedan stopped. The man in the passenger seat, large, quiet, smelling faintly of cigarette smoke and something medicinal, opened her door without a word and waited. Linette looked at the building in front of her. It was unremarkable. A converted warehouse, the brick scrubbed clean, no signage, 3 cameras visible above the entrance, and probably more she couldn't see. The windows on the upper floors were lit. Someone was awake. She got out because there was no alternative she'd yet calculated that didn't end worse. The inside was not what she expected. She didn't know exactly what she'd expected. Something from a movie, maybe. Something that looked like danger. Instead, it looked like an extremely well-funded logistics operation. Rows of filing systems. Whiteboards covered in numbers and abbreviations she didn't immediately recognize but could probably pass, given 20 minutes. People moving with the quiet efficiency of a company that had been doing what it did for a long time and had no reason to hurry. Nobody looked at her. She was taken upstairs by a different man, younger, suit too expensive for the building, earpiece visible, and left in a room that contained a long table, 8 chairs, a water pitcher, and a window overlooking the warehouse floor below. She sat. She poured herself a glass of water because her throat was dry, and she needed something to do with her hands. She waited. He came in 40 minutes later. Linette had been doing accounting long enough to know that the most important person in any room was rarely the loudest one, and almost never the first one through the door. She'd been expecting someone who announced himself. What she got was a man who entered like a room, was something he tolerated rather than occupied. Like he'd have been equally comfortable in an empty parking lot or the floor of a stock exchange, and neither setting would have changed anything about him. Voss. That was the name she'd heard exactly once, from Roland, his voice dropping the way it did when something frightened him. He hadn't used a first name. She didn't think Roland knew it. He was older than she'd expected. Mid-40s, maybe. Not old, but the kind of age that had arrived through experience rather than years. There was a scar along his jaw, faded but raised, the kind that had healed badly, because no one had bothered to treat it properly at the time. He wore no tie. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow with the precision of someone who did it every day without thinking. He carried a folder. He set the folder on the table. He did not sit. He looked at her the way she'd looked at Roland's accounts the first time she'd inherited them, with the patient, slightly tired attention of someone who expects to find a problem and is simply waiting to identify where. "You do Roland Marsh's books," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was level, not unkind, not warm. The voice of someone who said what he meant because he found it inefficient to say anything else. For 3 years, Linette said. Before that, 2 years at a freight brokerage. Before that, I was finishing a degree I didn't finish. Why didn't you finish it? She looked at him. Because my mother got sick and Roland stopped paying for things he'd agreed to pay for. Something shifted in his expression, not sympathy, not pity, more like a variable being noted and filed. Roland owes me $40,000, Voss said. He appears to believe you are equivalent to that debt. Roland is incorrect about a number of things, Linette said. That's one of them. A pause, short, almost undetectable. What is he incorrect about? He thinks 40,000 covers what he owes you. She reached for the water glass again. It doesn't. His receivables were in a state of creative accounting that would have caught up with him inside of 8 months, regardless of whether he found a way to pay you. There are 3 other creditors he's been rotating payments between to keep them all just satisfied enough not to escalate. He's been doing it for about 14 months. He's very nearly out of rotation. Voss pulled out the chair across from her and sat. She had not expected that. How do you know which creditors? He said. Because I opened his mail. She put the glass down. He told me not to. I did it anyway, because I was the one entering the numbers, and I needed the numbers to be accurate, and Roland's version of accuracy has always been optimistic. He opened the folder. He turned it so were photocopies. Accounts, figures, dates. Roland's accounts. Not all of them, but enough. Tell me what's missing, he said. Linette looked at the papers for a long moment. She thought about a lot of things in that moment. The sedan outside, the cameras she'd counted, the way no one downstairs had looked at her, the way Voss had come in alone and sat down across from her, like she was someone worth sitting across from. She pulled the folder toward her. It took her 2.5 hours, not because she was slow. Because his records, the ones he showed her gradually as the night progressed, were meticulous in some places and deliberately obscured in others, and she needed to understand the obscured parts before she could tell him where Roland's numbers didn't match his. It was like reconciling 2 sets of books that had been written in different dialects of the same language, and the work of translation was careful and slow. Voss had someone bring coffee around midnight. He drank his without comment. He asked questions, specific, informed questions, the kind that told her he understood what she was explaining and was testing whether she understood it too. He didn't tell her she was smart. She didn't need him to. The questions told her enough. Around 1 in the morning she found the gap, an $11,000 discrepancy between what Roland had reported, receiving from one of Voss's distribution intermediaries, and what she suspected had actually moved based on the freight volumes cross-referenced against the invoicing schedule she'd partly reconstructed from memory and partly inferred from the data in front of her. There, she said, and pointed. Voss looked at where she was pointing for a long time. You did that from memory. The freight volumes are hard to fake if you know what regional delivery windows look like for that kind of weight class. I worked freight brokerage for 2 years. I know what the numbers should look like. He closed the folder. You've been living in Roland Marsh's house, he said, doing his books. For 3 years. Yes, and you didn't take anything. She looked at him steadily. Define taking. You had access to his accounts. You could have skimmed. Could have moved money to somewhere he wouldn't notice for a long time. I could have, she agreed. I didn't. Why not? She thought about how to answer that, and decided that someone who asked questions the way he asked them would not be well served by anything less than accurate. Because I needed it to not be my fault when it fell apart. If I took money, it would have been my fault. I needed it to be his. Another pause. Longer this time. Where are you planning to go, he said. When you leave here. It wasn't really a question either. It was a map of her situation, drawn by someone with better cartography skills than her. She had $214 in a checking account Roland didn't know about, and a duffel bag of clothes she'd packed 3 months ago and kept under the bed because she'd known, on some level, that this moment was eventually coming. She had no family her mother's side couldn't also be leveraged through. She had no apartment, No lease, no job she hadn't just effectively abandoned by being driven across the city in the middle of the night. She said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. "I have a proposition," Voss said. She waited. "My current accounts manager is competent," he said, "which is different from being good. I've been aware of the difference for approximately 18 months and have not yet found a viable replacement, because finding someone with the right skills who can operate in this environment without becoming either a liability or a problem is—" He stopped. "Difficult. What does operate in this environment mean?" Linette said. "It means you would know things that cannot be unknowed. It means there are protocols. It means the work is real. Actual accounts management, logistics costing, payroll for 312 employees across 8 businesses, most of which are legitimate. And the compensation reflects the reality of the position. And if I say no, then I have someone drive you wherever you want to go. And Roland's debt remains Roland's problem." He said it flatly. "I don't trade in people, Miss Marsh. Roland does. That's part of why Roland currently owes me more than he can pay." She looked at him. At the scar along his jaw, the stillness of him, the way he'd sat with her figures for 2.5 hours without checking his phone, without losing the thread, without pretending to understand something he didn't. She thought about the folder, the quality of his records in the places where they were good. She thought about the question he'd asked. "You didn't take anything." She thought about what it would mean to be someone whose competence was actually the point. "I want a contract," she said, "written, specific about scope and compensation. No verbal agreements, nothing implied." Something crossed his face that wasn't quite a smile. It didn't have the shape of a smile, but it had something of the same quality, something that registered a result it had been waiting for. "Drafted by morning," he said. She had a room on the 4th floor. Not a cell, a room with an actual lock she controlled, a window that looked east toward the river, furniture that was plain and good quality and showed no interest in impressing anyone. She didn't sleep much. She sat on the edge of the bed and ran numbers in her head, not Voss's numbers, her own. And somewhere around 4 in the morning, she arrived at the same conclusion she'd been circling. She had been in worse situations with worse options, and she had gotten out of all of them. She would get out of this one too, whatever this one turned out to be. In the morning there was a contract. It was 6 pages, typed, indexed, with definition section and an appendix specifying what sensitive operational information meant and what the protocols were for handling it. She read every word. She flagged 2 clauses. He amended them without argument, which told her more about him than the amendments themselves. She signed. The first 3 months were like learning to read in a language she partially already knew. The businesses were real. A freight company, a restaurant supply distributor, 2 commercial laundries, a hospitality management group, a private security firm, a waste processing operation, a real estate holding company. The accounts were layered, not complicated. There was a difference, and the layer structure made sense once she understood the logic of it, which took her about 6 weeks. She rebuilt the reconciliation process from scratch because the previous system had gaps that would have caused problems within a year, and the previous accounts manager, a quiet man named Tolbert, who was visibly relieved to be reassigned, had not been wrong about the system, just incurious about its limits. Voss noticed. He said nothing about it directly. What he did was start copying her on correspondence he hadn't before, which was its own kind of language. She ate in the building's kitchen, which served staff meals 3 times a day in a room that was more canteen than cafeteria and had good coffee and terrible overhead lighting. She ate mostly alone, not because people avoided her, but because she hadn't yet built the context to have conversations that weren't about work. She was aware that she was an outlier, a woman who'd arrived in a manner that was not standard onboarding, who now sat in an office 2 doors down from Voss's and handled payroll for 312 people. She knew people were curious. She also knew they were professional, which meant the curiosity stayed where it belonged. She was fine with that. What she was less fine with, and didn't tell anyone, was the way the work felt like the first thing in 4 years that had asked her to use her full capacity. She'd spent 3 years making Roland's mediocre decisions look better than they were, hiding his incompetence in the margins of spreadsheets he never looked at closely. And before that, she'd spent 2 years in freight brokerage, entering data that someone else had already analyzed. The work here was not decorative. The work here was load-bearing. If she made an error, real things broke. If she did the work well, real things held. She had not anticipated how much that would matter to her. She found the problem in month 4. She wasn't looking for it. She was running a routine reconciliation on the waste processing operation. Tedious work, high volume, lots of municipal contract variables. And she found a line item that didn't belong. Not large enough to be obvious, exactly the right size to be undetectable to someone who wasn't paying close attention. She stared at it for a long time. Then she pulled the last 18 months of records and started looking. It took her 3 days, working early mornings before the building filled up, to map the full structure of what she was looking at. Someone had been skimming from 3 of the businesses, not recklessly, not greedily, but methodically, over a period of about 22 months. The total was not catastrophic, but the method was intelligent, and the intelligence of it meant someone with access, someone who understood the layer structure, someone who had been in a position to observe the accounts from the inside for long enough to find the gaps. The previous accounts manager had been in that position for 22 months before reassignment. She sat with that knowledge for an entire day before she decided what to do with it. She could have left it. The amounts were not disruptive. Tolbert was already reassigned. Whatever arrangement he'd had was presumably over, and surfacing it would mean demonstrating that she'd found something the previous system had missed for nearly 2 years, which was both an asset and a complication. She thought about what she'd told Voss in that first meeting. I needed it to not be my fault when it fell apart. Same principle, different application. She put together a clean summary, figures, dates, the full mapping, and left it on Voss's desk at 7:15 in the morning with a note that said only, "Found this in the WP reconciliation. 18 months, not recent. Full scope attached." He came to her office at 9. He closed the door. He never closed the door. She'd noticed that. It was something he did to signal a conversation was different. And he sat in the chair across from her desk, which was the reverse of how their first meeting had been arranged. And he said, "How long did it take you to find this?" 3 days once I spotted the first line, item. And before that, I wasn't looking. But you found it anyway. It was in the reconciliation. I was doing the reconciliation. He set the papers down on her desk. He looked at her in the way she'd come to recognize, the variable assessment look, patient and precise. "You could have left it," he said. "I could have," she agreed. "I didn't." He almost smiled again. The same non-smile, the same quality, something recognizing a result it had expected and was satisfied to have confirmed. "What do you need?" he said. "For what?" "For the work. Whatever you don't have that would make the accounts more solid." She thought about it. She'd been thinking about it for 4 months. She had a list. Read access to the freight company's dispatch logs going back 3 years. A second person on the municipal contract reviews. I can't catch my own errors, and that tier needs 2 sets of eyes. And a direct line into the hospitality group's event booking, so I can cross-reference cash flow against the actual event calendar instead of waiting for end-of-month reporting. He nodded once. "Done." He picked up the papers. He stood. "Linette," he said. It was the first time he had used her first name. She noticed this the way you notice a change in the sound of a building. The ambient quality of it shifts before you consciously register the specific difference. "Voss," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he left. Month 7 was when Roland found her. Not in person. Roland was not stupid enough to come in person. He sent a lawyer, or someone presenting himself as a lawyer, with a letter arguing that Linette's current employment arrangement constituted an involuntary transfer of her services, and that Roland retained certain rights as her. The letter used the word guardian, which was almost funny because Linette was 29 years old and hadn't been anyone's ward since she was 17. The lawyer waited in the lobby for 20 minutes and then left. She heard about it afterward from the man at the front desk, who mentioned it with the same flat intonation he used for everything. A quality she'd come to appreciate in the people around her, the way they treated information as information rather than drama. She drafted a response that evening, not aggressive, not emotional, simply a precise accounting of why the letter's central claim was legally incoherent, and sent it to the address the lawyer had left. She copied Voss because he had a right to know, and because she'd learned that keeping Voss informed of things that affected his operation was more efficient than the alternative. He responded to her copy with 2 words, already handled. She didn't ask what that meant. She figured Roland would stop being a variable, and he did. She didn't understand what was changing between her and Voss until month 9. And even then she understood it the way she understood a figures anomaly. Something in the pattern that required attention before she could name it. He started eating dinner in the kitchen instead of his office. She ate dinner in the kitchen. This was not the cause or the effect. It was simply a condition they occupied simultaneously, 3 or 4 nights a week, at the long table in the bad lighting. With food that was good and plentiful, because Voss considered functional staff a competitive advantage, and food was part of that. They talked about work. Then they talked about things adjacent to work, freight corridor trends, municipal contract cycles, the particular absurdity of commercial laundry accounting in high humidity climates. Then, gradually, they talked about other things, a book she was reading, a problem with the Eastern warehouse's ventilation that had been bothering him for 3 months, the specific way certain kinds of decisions felt different at 2 in the afternoon versus 2 in the morning. He was not warm, exactly. He did not perform warmth. What he was, she realized, was accurate. The way he'd been in their first conversation, precise about what was real and uninterested in anything that wasn't. When he asked how she was, he meant it in the way accountants mean questions. He wanted an actual answer, not a social noise. She had spent a long time around people who asked questions they didn't want answered. It was disorienting. And then it wasn't. And then it was something she couldn't imagine going back from. In month 10, during a late-night reconciliation on the hospitality group's books, she'd found another discrepancy, small, likely an honest error, but requiring attention. He brought her coffee and sat in the second chair in her office with a report of his own, and for 2 hours they worked in the same room in silence that had no weight to it, no friction. The comfortable silence of 2 people who were each using the space the way they needed to, and not apologizing for it. At some point, she looked up, and he was looking at her. "You're not afraid of me," he said. She considered this. "Should I be? Most people are. Most people don't understand what they're looking at," she said. "They see the business, and they invent the rest. I see the accounts. I know exactly what I'm looking at. And what are you looking at?" She thought about the freight company, the laundries, the hospitality group, the payroll of 312 people who went home at the end of their shift and paid their mortgages and put their kids through school. She thought about the layer structure and how it worked and the logic she'd eventually understood. Someone who built something that functions, she said, and maintains it, and doesn't burn it down for short-term gain. A silence, that's a more accurate read than most, he said. I told you, I know what I'm looking at. Roland Marsh died in February, not by anything dramatic, not by anything she'd been told to expect. A heart attack, the kind that had been accumulating for 15 years and finally arrived. She found out from a news alert on her phone at 8 in the morning and sat with it for a while before she was able to identify what she was feeling, which turned out to be nothing, specifically. Not relief, not grief. The mathematical closure of an equation that had been unresolved for a long time. She mentioned it to Voss at dinner. He was quiet for a moment, then, "Do you need anything?" Not "Are you okay?" Not "How are you feeling?" Not a performance of the question, just the actual substance of it. "No," she said. "I think I'm fine. You think?" She looked at the table for a moment. "I waited for something to change when I heard. I think I was expecting, I don't know, something. And nothing changed. I'm sitting here. The books are the same. The building is the same." She paused. "I'm the same. Is that bad?" "No." she said it slowly, testing its accuracy. No, I think it means I already left. I just didn't have the paperwork. He looked at her. In the bad light, his face had the quality it always did. Reserved, patient, marked by the scar along his jaw and the specific tiredness of someone who had been doing difficult work for a long time. But there was something else in it, too. Something that had been accumulating in the same way that things had accumulated in the accounts she'd come to know, gradually, in increments too small to flag on their own, until you looked at the whole and saw what had been building. Linette, he said. Voss, she said. It had become a kind of shorthand, she realized, a notation they used instead of a longer statement. He reached across the table and set his hand over hers. Not a gesture, a fact. She turned her hand over. The morning she walked into the accounts review with the full restructuring proposal she'd been building for 6 weeks. A complete revision of the layer architecture that would reduce reconciliation time by 30%, flag anomalies earlier, and make the book survivable by someone else if something ever happened to her. She put it on the table in front of Voss and his operations director and the freight company's site manager and said, "This is what we do instead of what we've been doing." Nobody argued. Partly because the numbers were good. Partly because Linette Marsh had been there for 18 months by then, and the people in that room had learned, gradually, what she was. She was the one who found what other people didn't find. She was the one who could tell you exactly what you were looking at, and why, and what it meant. Afterward, Voss walked with her back toward the offices. Not unusual, their paths aligned, and said quietly, "You could have kept that to yourself. Why would I? Made yourself harder to replace." She stopped. She looked at him. "I'm not interested in being kept," she said. "I'm interested in the work being right." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said. "That's the part I was never going to find anywhere else." She started walking again. He fell into step beside her. The building ran around them in its usual register, quiet, efficient, functional, and Linette Marsh moved through it without lowering her eyes. Because this was her building now, these were her accounts. And she had earned every square foot of it with nothing except the one thing she'd always had, and that no one had ever thought to take seriously. She knew exactly what she was looking at, and she wasn't afraid of any of it.